So those of you just joining us, we are Museum Blue, and this is the artist talk for Scattered with Leslie Friedman and Stacy Maya Johnson. I am Lauren Cardenas, one of the co-curators of Museum Blue, and I'm here with Mike Bailey, who's also another co-curator. So we're gonna kind of go into this slideshow.
Hello, everyone. Mike Bailey. Thanks again for joining us. As Lauren said, we put together a slideshow, and we thought we would just give a little bit of information about Museum Blue for those of you that may not be that familiar. Museum Blue is a project space that was founded by Lauren, myself, and some artist friends of ours, Carly Trosclair and Gina Grafos, in 2014. And it was a physical space that existed in downtown St. Louis. And we had programming out of that space for a couple of years. The programming primarily was exhibitions in terms of the format. We did have a few artist talks and things of that nature, as well as some other sort of arts related events. But it was a project space that was really meant to kind of create another space or stage for conversation and discourse around contemporary art practice. That existed, as I said, for a couple of years, and then we moved out of that space, and we tried for a bit to reestablish and find a new physical space. But some of the members of Museum Blue had other projects coming, some of them relocated, and so it more or less kind of got put on a shelf for a bit. And then about a year later, Lauren reached out to the three of us, Gina and Carly, myself, and was presenting the idea of re-engaging or rebooting Museum Blue, but doing it in a new format so that it would primarily exist in a virtual sort of capacity, and utilizing the website and things such as this, using Zoom to create these types of talks and exchanges that would then go on to become documents that will be saved on the Museum Blue website. So in that sense, the website will continue to grow as this kind of repository of content relating to contemporary art. So that happened with Lauren reaching back out to us about a year ago. And then Gina and Carly both are incredibly busy women, and wished us the best, but could not jump in on this next chapter of Museum Blue. However, Lauren and I decided to move forward with it. And our very first project is the project that we'll be talking with you about today, Scattered.
And so Scattered, presented by Museum Blue, is a new conversation by Leslie Friedman and Stacy Maya Johnson, and is an exploration of color, pattern through the mediums of printmaking and painting, and both artists work in an additive method, generating powerful visual experiences. And Leslie Friedman is an educator who specializes in printmaking and sculpture and installation. And she holds a political theory from a BA in political theory from Brown University, and an MFA in printmaking from the Tyler School of Art at Temple University. She's currently in Philadelphia, teaching at Kutztown University. And then Stacy Maya Johnson, who was born in Iowa and lives and works in Bushwick, Brooklyn. She received her MFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago. And she is currently in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And you're working on a MA. This is new.
It's a master's in urban policy.
Yes. Okay. And so these are the two artists that we are presenting in this new reboot of Museum Blue. And so.
Right. And I would just to kind of, I guess, continue or add on to that a little bit. When Lauren and I got back together and started talking about this new iteration of Museum Blue, we settled on the idea of, and I first of all want to thank the two artists, Leslie and Stacy, for getting on board with us because as they will tell you, although they may be too kind to talk too much about it, but it's been a learning experience for us because we've been trying to figure out, how can we best put together an exhibition that could exist virtually, potentially have the ability to have a real sort of physical component to it as well. What were different types of mechanisms or strategies we could employ to create opportunities for dialogue around the project, access for audience to the project. That's at the heart of it. I think for Lauren and I, like the whole point of running something like Museum Blue is about what it can serve as and what its function is in terms of a springboard into discussion and ideas that comes around contemporary art practice. But as Lauren and I were moving towards thinking about how this new model would come together, we sort of settled on the idea of thinking almost about a conversation show. And by that, I think we thought, well, let's work with this two-person sort of model where the two artists that we identify and bring together for the project could kind of exist over the course of the duration of the project in a way in which a conversation might begin to generate. And whether that conversation is in the conventional sense, the artists corresponding, or whether it's more of a conversation that unfolds through the visual exchange of their work being presented together. I think that was a leading point of interest for us in the new model of Museum Blue.
And so I think we're just gonna kind of go into the exhibition. And so Leslie, could you kind of talk a little bit about Purse Bottom Blues and like maybe the impetus of this, because it's from 2019 2021, so it's kind of an ongoing project, and like you've kind of been working in these kind of embroidered digital patches for a little bit now, and so now it's kind of like unfolding and kind of moving, so kind of if you want to kind of maybe expand on that.
Sure. So yeah, this is a piece, this particular piece, I would say, didn't get started until 2020, but as an idea, it's been evolving. I am a printmaker. A lot of my work I make is I'll print some kind of small thing or relatively small thing that then can be built into something larger. So some people might look at this work and say, oh, there's nothing printed when you think of like the academic print shop, whether it's like etching, silk screen, woodcut. These are digitally embroidered patches. So they're not really printed, but in many ways, if you sort of expand your idea of printmaking, they are, because there's this matrix, it's a digital matrix, and then it's sent out and out comes like all these same fabric components. They're patches, just like you might have if you were like a Girl Scout and you wanted to have patches on a sash, or if you were putting patches on a jean jacket or something like that. They're like a twill base, and then they have embroidered floss on top. So they're kind of like an interesting two-dimensional, almost three-dimensional object. But I started working with patches in, I think, 2019, when I started a larger project called Yada Yada Yada, which was this idea of like a fictitious, all-female, all-Jewish biker gang with the leader of the biker gang being an alter ego of mine named Halakanish. And so I made some patches because I was sort of thinking about how wouldn't it be nice to make artwork that was $15, something that people could easily purchase without having to be in a certain kind of salary range, or could be more of an impulse purchase. So I played around with some patches, had them send them out into the ether, had them come back in the mail, and I was immediately taken with the quality. I thought they were so cool looking, and I wanted to then build them into something larger, which is a way that I've worked for a while. But I already had plans for those. I wanted each one to be 15, to $20. I didn't want them to be super expensive. So next time I went back to like creating a new idea, I had this little seed in the back of my head that I wanted patches that could be built into something larger. And so the piece that came in between those initial patches and this piece were like these 6-sided star pieces that I connected and made a wall hanging. And while I was working on that, I realized that they didn't all have to be regular shapes. I thought, I think there's some potential here if I had odd shapes that could be pieced together. So the question for myself was, what would those odd pieces be? And I wanted it to be part of this world, this Holokinish world. And so my alter ego is this kind of traveling woman of the world. She's girly, but she's also into things like, working on bikes. So what would be in the bottom of her purse? And she might have a wrench, she might have lip balm, she might have condoms, she might have a shopping list that includes bagels and apples and vinegar. So these are the things that would be on the bottom of Holokinish's purse, as if like every day she's sort of emptying out her purse. And so these things just accumulate over and over time. So some of this is a matter of just like giving myself an assignment of how I'd like to be working, what I want the process to be, and then also thinking about how that process could then make sense with the concepts, this growing body of work, how the concepts could work together.
Awesome. Thank you.
That's great. Can I jump in real quick? I was curious. You said you talked a little bit, Leslie, about your the kind of the method of how this piece came together and some of the ideas that were driving you towards certain materials and working with certain processes. And so you talked about the accessibility, where you wanted people to be able to buy something like an art piece at a price point that more people could afford, so that notion of like democratizing art. Could you talk a little bit more about how you think of that, or how that factors into your art philosophy?
And I think, well, part of that goes back to how I even got started making art. I studied, as you saw from my bio, I studied political science. And when I was in college, I was friends with a lot of people who had bands. So I was kind of like student by day, and then I would go see lots of local music or national acts at night. I would go to like 3 or 4 shows a week. And one summer I took a free silkscreen tutorial at AS220, which is an arts organization in downtown Providence. So I learned how to silkscreen, and I started realizing, wow, Providence has this really rich silkscreen community, and a lot of the times they're making gig posters. Why can't I make gig posters? So I started screen printing gig posters for my friends' bands. I'd wheat paste them around town, and then whatever I had left over, I'd sell for like $10 at a show. And then later, when I started to realize that this fun I was having in the print shop was more than just a hobby, it was becoming part of my identity. I really wanted to continue to study printmaking, and I wanted to go on to, make this my career. That kind of like mental leap of like, well, what's the difference between a poster and a print? It's like a zero, like a print's $10, a print's $100. A poster is 10, but they're made the same way. Maybe the paper's a little cheaper that you're printing on. So there's some of that just as like part of, an internal struggle, or like my origin story with being an artist, and then going on to make artwork that ends up being priced much higher, but still wanting to make work that isn't about, thousands and thousands of dollars, or isn't just for a select group of people. I do think, though, there is a struggle, I think, with anyone who works similarly to me in terms of installation work, where they make lots of small components. A lot of times people will say, well, can I just buy just one? And then what ends up happening is that can then devalue the whole. So, for example, a piece like this, I had a lot of people want to buy just individual patches, but usually I try to mentally have work that is meant to be sold individually, and then pieces that are components that are built into something larger, because I think that can get a little bit confusing. But then again, the art world is very confusing when it comes to pricing work and valuing work. And I don't really have a great answer for that. But There's also always been like a play of high and low in my work. I love work using materials that are unconventional art materials, be they, things you get at Home Depot, like flooring, to, I guess here, using kinds of patches that you wouldn't necessarily think of as being a drawing tool or an installation or sculptural tool. So that is not unusual for my work. Um,
Right, right. I mean, in looking at, the patches and just sort of what they serve as, signifiers, or it's this collection of kind of everyday stuff, the kind of banal thing that is just around us. And so, but by taking it, and this is an interesting thing, because I talk with my students oftentimes about like the function of art, and say something specific like portraiture, when it's like, well, who is a portrait made of, and why, and what, and who says, and what sort of qualifies it to be sort of made into this art form that kind of goes on to serve as this document that could be in place for centuries, right? And then in that sense, it carries with it information. And so I think those are all thoughts that come to my mind, and I love that you've decided to dig into the person, elevate the items.
yeah.
Yeah.
Great. We're gonna go to the next slide.
All right. So so this next slide features a couple of paintings of Stacy's, and I would take this moment just to kind of say again, to kind of give further context about how this project comes about. Both of the artists were gracious enough to speak with my students. They also met and spoke with Lauren's students, and the work that Lauren and I do outside of sort of the the academic setting on these types of projects such as Museum Blue, it oftentimes finds its way back into the work we do in academia. And in fact, I just saw that one of my students signed up for the talk, so yay, good to see you there. But I think that the thing that I shared with them when they met with my students is, I said, Stacy is this painter that I met like 15 years ago when she and I were both doing an artist residency in Vermont. And I was using sort of that story, and I'm using it here with the group in today's webcast, to kind of talk about the importance of connectivity and talk about the importance of network. And so Stacy's someone that I have, had this relationship with and been aware of her work since that point. And we've collaborated on a curatorial project years ago. And I've just kind of, been aware of how her work has developed. And so when Lauren and I started thinking about artists that could come together, Stacy came to my mind when I saw Leslie's work. And I think at first it was purely just kind of on a visual level, and thinking about how both artists work with like really saturated colors, or work with a kind of like, how do they organize something within a parameter? And that sort of comes back to this idea of the interior that Lauren, I think you might have mentioned earlier. I think we're going to get into it a little bit further, but coming back to the idea of the interior of the rectangle, and sort of what is the potential there, and what are sort of the intentions there, and what are some of the guide stars that Stacy as a painter sort of uses, to generate her work. I know when she presented to my students, she talked about kind of coming out of this modernist, influenced by various modernist principles as a painter. But I'm going to shut up and let Stacy tell us more, because she knows much more about her paintings than I do. So Stacy.
If I can unmute myself, there's Brooklyn noises in the background. I mean, to think about the modernism comment and the edge, I definitely think about the edge, and I definitely have battled with this idea of like an all over pattern versus like a composition. And so that's always something I'm thinking about. And I tend to focus on a composition. Only recently have I sort of allowed myself to have this like more all over pattern, which you can see in the painting that's up on the screen, but also right here. Like the background, a lot of times the backgrounds are like kind of like a bit more like a design or a pattern that you might find on like fabric, like wallpaper or something. And then I kind of build something that's more specific, that's sort of stuck inside. And I could say the picture on the right, the painting that's also behind me is I started off with using some ink from a printer. So that's one of the only things that's kind of new in the last year, which is like I just happened upon all this leftover printer ink, and I did my best to try to use it. It's such like vibrant color, but then also try to make sure that it's somewhat archival, because I'm not sure how it'll last over time. But I did put like clear gesso on top of it to sort of seal it. And I did a test to like put it in the window to make sure it didn't fade, and it doesn't seem to be fading. But you know, I hope that if you were here in person, you'd be able to see a bit more change in texture between the different parts of the painting.
Great. And so I was thinking also, maybe if we can move to the next slide. And this painting carries the title "Foreshadowing Coronavirus," and I think we'll have to address the elephant in the room, of course, and that part of Museum Blue functioning in this virtual format is largely because of the pandemic, and so there were aspects of I don't know, thinking about this show, thinking about the work that Lauren and I were looking at, that these two artists were making or had made leading up to the show, and I was thinking about this idea of interior as a thing that kind of holds something, right? And within the referencing the modernist idea again to the rectangle, and sort of what is the potential within inside this very precise format, and what can it hold, and how is it organized, and I think then about the title of the show being Scattered, and how I think in many ways it's sort of a feeling that we all have been working through this period of the pandemic. But then I'm also thinking about the process that both of these artists employ. And as Stacy shared just a moment ago, she talked about using ink from a printer as a way to kind of like enter into a painting. And we look at some of her paintings, and they're highly, they have that saturated color, and there's a lot of activity and things going on. But yet there still seems to be like, how is it contained by the perimeter of the edge of the painting? How is it held? What is that interior doing? What is its function? And how do you negotiate the idea of sort of scattered thoughts, scattered compositions, scattered, sort of starts of a painting, the false starts, the successes, and then finally arriving at it where it feels like, okay, it's holding what it needs to, within that sort of confinement of the frame, it's arrived, and I have stepped away from that. And I know that's a hard question, because I spend a lot of time thinking about it too myself. I talk about it with my students, and but I don't know if that's something you would care to jump in on, Stacy, as it relates to your practice.
I moved the screen up just a little so you could see that other painting up there. I mean, all I know is that I have a tendency to overdo the paintings rather than underdo the paintings. I definitely don't like, I want there to be like, for some reason I'm a little attached to like, I want the viewer to be impressed with like the work ethic, as well as just like the like accident. Like I know a lot of people will make like 10 paintings and throw them all away except for 2. And I definitely am not like that. I'm like, I will work it and rework it and rework it until it gets complete. Like maybe only once in 10 years have I ever just totally abandoned a painting. But it's like a fine line, and I don't have an answer necessarily, but I definitely have had my own like thoughts about like for example, right now I'm pretty busy because I just started this new grad program, but I was like, actually, this might be a benefit to me because maybe I won't overwork the paintings. Like, right, maybe I'll have to come up with like a simpler, like I'm always trying to challenge myself to like just make a mess and just walk away. But it's totally not my personality. So it's like, you know, a constant negotiation.
Right. Right. As you were sharing those thoughts, Stacy, I was thinking about, in a slide, in a couple of slides, we'll get to it, but there was kind of some words that Laura and I had been making notes of as we were reflecting on both your work and Leslie's work. And one of those is, or two of those words is conceal and reveal. And I think about, like, as a painter, like, what are you, when you talk about reworking, and you talk about painting over or painting out, and what do you sort of like push back? It's still, of course, a part of the history of that painting, and it translates into maybe the surface or some kind of tactile quality, but it's a part of that painting. But then what is revealed, and I think that also speaks to Leslie's work in terms of what is concealed within the interior of the purse, and then what is revealed. And in the case of the installation that Leslie put together, it's sort of all revealed for us, but I'm just sharing thoughts with you both, kind of from my perspective and conversations that Lauren and I have been having around your work, but I wonder, does that sort of like idea of, I guess it kind of gets at the same question of when do you know the painting is there, and in that sense you allow it to sort of reveal what it has visually to sort of offer, and the decisions that were made to edit, change, conceal, paint over, so on and so forth.
So kind of piggybacking off of that, because I think that kind of goes into the next slide of thinking about, especially that last line that is underlined. Each picture is piled with perhaps a year's worth of varying light, emotion, and activity. And I think like the things that the two of you are kind of grappling with, of like figuring out whether it's for Leslie of this compiling of this web of small pieces to create a larger work, or Stacy, it's this reworking and working of a painting until like it's finished. But like what the viewer often doesn't always see is that like internal like struggle or like conversation or dialogue that an artist has within the work. Like normally the presentation within that is like it should be pristine, it should look flawless, or it should look like it is this finished work. But in reality, I think that's the one thing that we each grapple with as being artists, as being educators, as like working singularly in one studio or working in a group in like a larger space, of like when does that emotion, when does that activity get to be brought to the forefront outside of in a conversation, because that's also not the thing in a statement, like a artist statement or a statement about the work. I mean, I tell my students like it should be concise, it should kind of be this overarching theme that you're kind of pulling on these threads, as opposed to this short novena that is explaining the start to finish, like the long journey, the marathon that we're kind of all in. And I think that's what's interesting about this project, kind of bringing the two of you together that are living in separate cities. I mean, the four of us are all living in separate cities, and kind of working through this long project that is not, it's an odd exhibition since it's long, it's kind of disconnected in the same, in some sort of sense. It's on the internet, and like thinking of how that relates to the current 14 months that we've been in, of like that disconnection, reconnection, and how does, in those moments, when is it do we get to see the history of that, or do we never see the history? Is it really just about that kind of singular moment that we're able to witness? And so thinking as we go forward to the next slide, so we're just kind of focusing on like the foreshadowing of coronavirus and then a detail of like the purse bottom blues, and kind of going back to thinking about like the interior and exterior and the edges of like the painting, or like how do things kind of confined or hold in these works and scattered, and what is it that they hold, like what do the contents like talk to us about, like what is it, like these are two different pieces and they're made very differently, but like they kind of have similar conversations, or at least when Mike and I have been kind of looking at these works and kind of talking about them, I was like, is there a space that, or a boundary that requires action against it, like action against like kind of breaking out beyond those boundaries or beyond that confine.
Right. Right. And to jump in real quick, if you don't mind, Lauren, could you just pop back to that last slide?
Yes.
Because I wanted to say, and this was something that I became aware of. Stacy shared this with my students, and I think it's such a great, it was such a great idea, you know, for students, for all of us, really. I mean, I was really excited because it gave me something to kind of talk to students about, or, but I think it also gives anyone thinking about what art's function is and what the potential of art is. I really love the ideas that are in these sentences here. And I think, Stacy, you told me that you studied with Julia Fish. Is that right?
Yeah, Julia Fish was my advisor in graduate school, and she would make these paintings of her house, but they would just look like abstractions. So they might be like the corner of her tile floor and like maybe a little bit of the wood edge, the trim, or like her siding a lot of times. So like the siding of the outside of her house. And it might just look like kind of a grid. But she'd really get into like the way the colors would change, like things that were kind of weathered, you know, and she wouldn't paint from a photograph. And so they would build up this like, you know, this history of like maybe the light was one way in the morning and one way in the evening, and it's something she knew really well, right? Like something that you live with, it has like all this like mood with it. And so, you know, spending time with the real thing and then painting from it and about it at the same time.
Right. Right. Yeah, no, I really loved it. And so if you jump back or forward again, then Lauren, to those looking at these two works together, and the one on the right is a detail of Leslie's installation, but just sort of thinking about that previous slide about what it suggests in terms of an artwork can be this kind of vehicle that contains so much, from not just sort of that action that the artist takes in the studio in that particular moment, but just sort of everything that has accumulated, you know, the conversation from earlier that week, the frustration from getting a parking ticket because you forgot to move your car, the, you know, something that turned you on the radio because it was a really fascinating story, to the feeling of like just complete overwhelmed and sort of helplessness in the face of a pandemic. And, you know, and I just think about that as artists, you know, we are feeling these things, we're thinking of these things, we're processing these things, and then we sort of like offer up a response through this visual language, you know, in the case of Stacy with a painting practice, and then in the case of Leslie in this kind of expanded printmaking practice. But I would love to hear Stacy or Leslie, like seeing your works kind of side by side like this. Are there any thoughts that you would like to add or share?
One thing I was thinking about what you guys have been talking about taking all these elements from every day, and then are they being collaged together where they're covering up elements, or is it just like pieced and spreading out? And, pretty much, I guess I was sort of thinking, maybe you said it, or maybe you were sort of talking around this idea of like my works almost as looking like everything's out there. There's nothing's hidden. And I was thinking about like the term, the web that's happening in my work, and a little bit about how I doubt any of us in the last year are spending less time on our computer, or probably spending more time on social media than we were before. And as if we're like presenting everything all the time in this very like authentic way. But it's really not super authentic. Like this piece of mine where everything's visible, there's nothing hidden. It's still very curated. Like I'll even as the artist making the piece, I'll piece things together and then realize they don't work and have to cut them out and then fix it somehow. And you can't really tell that that's happened, but it's not like every piece that I connected at any point stayed exactly where it was. Similarly to how we present ourselves in the digital world, it may look like you're being very authentic and sincere, but it's also, you're only showing certain sides. So like, not that I do give myself assignments sometimes at work. This assignment or this project, I'm having all these different elements that are supposed to be in the bottom of this character's purse, or to almost like that assignment that we all get as freshmen of like doing a self-portrait with objects. But how much do you really know about a person by just looking at these individual objects? You can kind of imagine who she is or he is, but you wouldn't really necessarily know that person. So I don't know, I was just thinking, you were sort of talking about that idea of like putting it all out there. And I do think that's there, but I also think it can be, it can create this feeling of truth that may not be completely truthful, even though it's all out there.
Right. Right. I like that a lot, because it's, it speaks to this notion of authenticity, right? And when we do curate things in a very sort of specific way, do we start to like, move away from that idea of something that's very honest and authentic? Has it become sort of structured in a way for whatever, to support the concept or the content you're exploring to be more aesthetically pleasing, or whatever the choices might be, but I like that a lot. And I'm curious too, Leslie, if I've been fascinated in thinking about your work, and like, I wonder if when you sort of arrived at this idea, do you sort of, I don't know, like in any one of these items, the lip balm or the adjustable wrench, is there like a number of patches that you're like, I need to have this many, wrenches, I need to have this many tape measures, I need to have this many? I'm just curious. It's kind of maybe an out there question, but I'm just curious.
Well, so the way the patches are made, I design them and then I send them off to the company that prints them. And this is just like the same kind of place that might, make corporate caps or like, beer koozies or whatever. They do a bunch of different stuff. They're not usually working with artists. And so I'll design a bunch of patches, and generally I'll purchase like a number that makes sense to me. It's not so much money, but it's also like I'm gonna have plenty to work with, because like anything, if you're buying in bulk, the price gets cheaper. So some of it's like truly practical, like, oh, I'll just buy 300 because that gives me a nice price break, but it's not like so much money that I'm gonna be sitting with a bunch of these patches. And then when it gets to larger ones, like the wrench, it's interesting because they're larger, so they're more expensive. So I might get fewer of those, but then I realize visually like that I need more of them, and I kind of wish I'd ordered more. But the beautiful thing is I can always, contact the company and have them make more. I haven't yet done that because I usually am such a hoarder. I just buy in bulk to such an extreme. But if I know I could, but then I wonder like, will it really look the same? Because they might be produced at a different day with a different person on the line, and they might switch out a color or change the size ever so slightly. I have a feeling it probably wouldn't look all that different. Those are the things I think about. So I usually am buying, hundreds of patches, which may seem like a lot. It sort of depends on the day. Someday I'm like, oh, that's so many. And then when I'm really looking at it, it's like, I can fit this in one little box. It's not that much. So, that fear of running out of the supply. I have yet to do that, but I'm getting close on some of these. And then like little things like, I think I use a lot of the Starlight mints. So I maybe ordered just as many Starlight mints as I would bobby pins or whatever. And that's something maybe maybe it's the shape, maybe it's the color I want more of. So I end up needing to, conserve those, or maybe I'll have to reorder them if I keep growing this.
Yeah, what is the character's name again?
Hala Kanish.
Hala Kanish. And I just like to think that maybe there's enough of those like Cinnabon treats or whatever those are for her to have one every day, of them for the year or something. It's like,
but she needs to conserve. She can't have more than one a day, because that's a premium item. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. She has one a day.
So piggybacking on that, thinking about this conversation of authenticity and like the authentic self as opposed to the curated performed self, and like in these works, and like kind of referencing back to like these are the finished products, and we don't get to see that conversation of like the whether it's the misprints or the works that don't, the progress of like how these things don't maybe fit, and it kind of goes back to that level of intention, and that we make decisions, and we are actively making decisions. And especially for artists, I think that's a really important thing, is like decision making. And in teaching, and most like students, my favorite is always when we have that conversation. It's like, oh, this is random, like this is super random, or I didn't think about like why I picked that color. And I think there's something to be said of like, well, what if that color, or what if that, the way that that was created, or the way that you kind of pulled these things together, is because it was influenced by, maybe you went for a walk earlier that day, or like you had coffee, or like your instincts begin to come out. And one of the things that I kind of always relate back to teaching and with my students, and like to my practice, because it's always kind of like a nicer reminder of, is that Ira Glass talking about the gap, and like talking about how as we kind of progress and move forward in our careers, that gap between instincts and what is good gets smaller and smaller as we kind of progress. So as we learn and make mistakes and kind of work through failure, we understand like, or we begin to understand of like, oh, okay, this is what is finished. This is what I think is is meeting my expectations, as opposed to kind of like working through and just thinking like, no, this is it. This is kind of like, this is where I'm going to stop, because I've run out of time. I think like that's kind of like where you kind of move beyond, and like, or I guess for Stacy, like learning, like, I mean, I commend you for reworking and reworking until pieces are where you want them to be. And kind of thinking about that, it's like either moving through to that finish line, or maybe in this case, as you're kind of in this program of like taking like long breaks in between them. I'm more of an artist who, like, I like projects that are longer, so I can have like time to have a breather in between, because I'm impulsive, and I feel like I end up ruining things before I make them better. And so then I just have these like small pieces all over the studio of failures in projects, and then they later maybe come back into assemble into one, as opposed to kind of maybe just continuing on. And I think that's just the way that I see me as a maker. But like seeing the history in your paintings, and like how you kind of like see all those layers build up, is quite like, it's quite lovely and quite beautiful to kind of, and that's how it kind of creates this ebb and flow, and like that kind of almost like the painting is breathing, or like the painting is like, there is a sense of like movement. And it might also be because I watched a Marvel movie, and so there's a lot of CGI too. But they kind of has that nice, like you see that history, but then you also kind of see like the thinking about the blending of those lines and how it's pristine, or like there are areas that are so that seem really curated and like very well designed, but then it's kind of building up on top of that. So like we have that trompe l'oeil kind of coming in where the viewer is almost having that second, like, wait a minute, is this three-dimensional? Is this not three-dimensional? Is this coming off the wall? Is this like metallic? Is this not? And I think there's like a tactility in that. So
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with what Lauren's talking about. And I think that both of these artists, and it's one of the reasons I was really excited for them to meet with my students, is because you can look at both of these works that are up on the screen right now. And even though one is this kind of assemblage of materials and the others is more in the tradition of painting, like in a conventional sense of paint and on a surface, they both are very much invested in color. They both are very much invested in composition. They both are commenting on light. I mean, I think that, for instance, in Leslie's work, this play with shadow, and you might be able to see it, where this web-like kind of collection of patches is lifted just off the wall to create sort of that sense of space and shadow. But I think the other thought that comes to my mind about both of their works is there's this contrast that I think of in their works, like is part of the conceptual, like, for me, sort of the conceptual matter of it is in that Stacy operates within the tradition in many ways of this kind of modernist way of thinking about painting and how to make a painting, but yet there's this sort of playfulness and this kind of moments of looseness, moments of like saturated color, and feels like this kind of playfulness and celebration of those things, but yet it's in a very, very high crafted, very specific sort of language and how it's produced and how it's left for us to sort of interact with it. So I think like that contrast between playfulness and something that might feel organic or chance, but then also something very specific and rigid sort of playing out together within that rectangle. And then I think about that same idea of contrast in relation to Leslie's work, and this sort of conceptual idea of taking subject matters or subject matter and sort of saying this is going to become the art source. This is going to be what I talk to you about, these ideas. I'm going to do it in a way that's very thoughtful, very curated and specific, but it will have a little bit of humor to it. And in fact, that humor is kind of my delivery system to sort of give you this thing to think about. And I think I used the analogy, Leslie, when you were meeting with my students, it's like taking a little bit of sugar with your medicine, So if you're talking about a Jewish female biker gang, but you don't have to be Jewish or female to join the gang, there's kind of this like playfulness in that. But out of that sort of construct, you're generating this artwork to sort of talk about society and about identity and about groups and who says and how come they get to say, and that sort of thing.
And so on that note, I think I'm going to move to the next slide, which is just kind of words that words that we've kind of been talking about in this talk. And I think we'd like to open it up for questions from the audience if there are any. I think this would be a great time to take those. And feel free to either put them in the chat or I think we have a small group, enough of us to kind of ask. So also there's no pressure. You don't have to.
I might have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I know that some artists have, they feel like their art should stand on its own and that you shouldn't need to have a statement of intent or anything, a description of the art. But I always get so much more out of it if I know uh, what the artist had, what they were thinking going into it. Maybe if you're drawing a beautiful scene at the beach, you don't have to do that. But for something like this, I just get so much more out of the art if I have a statement to go on. Do you guys have any strong feelings one way or another, and do you always have some kind of statement explaining your intent?
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, Stacy.
I can answer a little. I mean, I actually don't usually, at least not per painting, right? Like maybe I do in terms of like the practice. But if it's about the painting, it's usually just to show pieces of the process, because it's really like driven by like the kind of ink I found, or like the kind of construction paper. Like I collect colored construction paper to cut up and like make shapes with and put on. Like I might start a painting and then I'll stop, I'll let it dry, and then in some cases I'll insert what's the right word, upload that image into Photoshop and play around with it. And then sometimes I'll just let it dry and cut up pieces of paper and like literally tape them onto the painting and like step back and, or like build a little maquette and like use the maquette. So just like as pure abstraction as I can get, like never like, oh, this is about a person or an emotion or a place. But so if anything, it's usually just to explain the materials in the process. And I feel kind of like stubborn about that. That's like, that's the limitation I've given myself.
I think for me, I generally will have like an artist statement somewhere, but I recognize that most people aren't going to read that statement. They're not going to necessarily see more than maybe the title of the piece, maybe just the title of the show. So I'm okay with the idea that not everyone's going to understand every aspect of what I'm thinking about as a maker, but I want to make sure the works are interesting visually, draw people in, make people ask questions, and try to make connections between the work. I think a lot of times artworks might not say very much on their own or give you a lot of clues on their own, but next to another piece, they might give you more information. So I do recognize that like it would be hard to know everything about why I made the piece that you're seeing in Scattered without hearing the story behind it. But I also think there's something just visually interesting about the piece on its own. So I guess the answer is I always have a statement, but I don't expect people to read it. And I understand that means that the audience who reads it is going to have a very different take on the artwork than had they not. But there should be something for both audiences.
Yep, that's great. Thanks. And just having a title for the artwork is a kind of a compromise between those two approaches. So thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Andy. I think that in my mind and the way I talk about it with students is that, it's really like anything, whether you're talking about art or whether you're talking about, I don't know, cooking or other, like literature or other forms of art, or even, I don't know, gardening. It's like the more you know, the richer it is, and it's not to say that it's upon the artist to make sure that it's to say that if you're an interested party in this kind of conversation, then the art may prompt you to say, wow, I really got to think about this again, or I need to kind of look into this further, or I want to, so I think that for me, I always kind of talk about it in those terms with my students, even though I do torture my students and require them to write artist statements.
I do the same. And thinking about how it's the opportunity for you to kind of initiate that dialogue, because you won't always be present, and allowing allowing that part of your voice to be heard, but also like making known that like you can't change how someone's going to react or kind of take in the work. I think that's always kind of important because I think sometimes when you start, you have these really strong intentions about the work, and then and that can lead to being defensive, but then you always get that one individual who, I don't know, sees the unicorn in the painting, or like is seeing something completely different, and it changes your perspective about your work and kind of makes you ask yourself new questions that might lead to new things, which I think is one of the great things about art, and opening up that dialogue, so that you can kind of continue building this community. Any other questions?
See that we have a couple in chat, a couple
Oh.
questions that came through in the chat.
Awesome. Okay, so there are two. So it's from Joanna B. So what are the artist's advice to art students? That's one. And then the next question is, how did the artist decide on the particular media they use? Do they think at some point they will expand beyond what they are currently using? Those are good questions.
I guess I'll start with the media. I definitely am always trying different media. Like sometimes I noodle with animation. This most recent project, there was a performance element to it that I hadn't had in my work before. So I think for me, keeping things fresh and new is often about trying new things and allowing myself to be an amateur with different materials. But why did I start off? We talked a little bit about the connection of this piece to printmaking, and that's sort of the entryway that I have in art. There's something about seeing something in multiples that just really makes me get all excited. And then the other side of printmaking is that it's a more community focused art form. Similarly to say, like you maybe see this if you ever go into a ceramic shop, there's usually not just one person working alone in their shop. It's usually a lot of people sharing the material, sharing kilns. In the case of printmaking, you don't need one press per person. You can share a lot of this stuff. So you see community print shops, you see more of a community spirit if you go into like a college print shop. And I think that was just something that really jived with my personality. So it's both visually like enjoying seeing something multiplied, like not just seeing one of something, but seeing the same thing next to each other. And then also just the actual making process being more social. That's one reason why I got into printmaking.
Yeah, I can try to add. I mean, I think for me, most people would assume that the like experimentation in my work is pretty tiny. But I'm still constantly, adding some strange, to me, like adding printer ink was like a little scary, right? Or like the last year I've been adding like marble dust to the paint. So it's just like really just playing with glossier flat and like a little bit of texture. Like occasionally I've added like some wood or like glued on some string to the canvas before I get started. Just some very small things like that, not going into photography or anything. On occasion, a show, usually if I have an exhibition, not in this case particularly, right? Because I don't have to do the installation, but I'll often add a wall painting or some kind of installation, or maybe like a site-specific painting that's specific to the people who work at the gallery or specific to the shadows that are already on the wall at the gallery. So usually I'll come up with at least one painting in an exhibition if it's a solo show to have it be like very specific to the place or the people that are there. And that's kind of an experimental process. And then advice to art students. I mean, I don't know if I have any advice. I just think like I love being in the studio. Um, and I love going to studio visits, and it'll just always be part of my life. And I feel like if you love it, you don't really need any advice, right? Like I feel like it's such a fun, wonderful privilege, and it's so satisfying that I think, you know, it's not like it's not an easy career or whatever, if you want to call. I don't consider my practice a career at all, but I I just think like it's just do it, right? Just do it for the love of it, and you know it'll guide you. You don't. It's not really worth like stressing out about.
The only advice I have is advice that I was given. I had a studio visit when I was in grad school with an artist from South Africa named Diane Victor, and she came in my studio. I was showing her, you know, what I was working on, and she was very gracious and looked at everything, and then said, you know, I feel like you're playing it really safe. So what I want you to do is make a list of all the things that you're afraid to do or afraid to say with your work, and then seriously consider doing them. And that advice for me was so helpful. And in terms of getting over hurdles within that the body work that I was working on in that moment, but it's advice that I keep reminding myself about. And then I feel like with my friends or my students or whoever I'm with, I think it's just advice that almost anyone needs to hear and think about in a specific moment. Like, why are you not allowing yourself certain options or solutions? And then really consider doing them. And you don't have to do them, but like instead of just sort of saying, nope, I don't do X, and then never questioning that.
Great. Thank you both for that.
Yeah.
Well, Lauren, what do you think? Is this
Yeah. Do we have any other questions? I think we've had a really good conversation. I guess.
yeah, I just want to go on the record of saying thank you again to Leslie and Stacy for working with us.
Yeah,
And
thank you. Thanks
and
for going on this kind of almost wild goose chase of like new possibilities.
a wild blue chase, is that what you said?
Oh, sure. Why not a wild blue chase?
um,
Yeah, it's been a great learning experience about learning about both of your works, but then also like sharing your works with my students. I know with Mike's students, and now with the public. So
right. Right. And then thank you to those of you that tuned in and spent some time this afternoon with us. And, you know, as we said at the top of the talk, it really is our hope that as Lauren and I continue to go through this and that we continue to build more and more content, sort of almost in this library of sorts that lives on the website of Museum Blue. So I know that, for instance, this talk will be something that I'll be referencing students and other people that have questions or ideas or are interested in, you know, contemporary art making. So it's really great.
Thank you for inviting us. This has been, you know, really fun and also interesting way of like continuing to show work during a time when it's difficult to show work.
yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I'm going to stop recording and also stop sharing if I can figure that out. Okay.